let me be straightforward about something that the entire basketball conversation seems determined to dance around, rather than confront directly. And I mean this with the kind of specificity that makes people uncomfortable at dinner tables and radio studios alike. The Los Angeles Lakers are currently winning basketball games at a genuinely impressive clip, building real momentum heading into the final stretch of the regular season, executing a defensive game plan that their own head coach described in postgame as nothing short of fantastic, and doing all of it without the man who has been positioned, marketed, and narratively constructed as the irreplaceable foundation upon which this entire operation rests. LeBron James is sitting at home somewhere in Los Angeles with arthritis in his left foot, watching Luka Doncic and Austin Reeves take apart playoff-caliber opponents with the kind of coordinated efficiency that makes neutral observers lean forward in their seats. And somewhere buried inside that sentence, there is either the most quietly encouraging development in Lakers basketball in several years, or the single most organizationally awkward conversation that has ever needed to happen before a superstar returns from injury. The maddening part, the part that makes this genuinely fascinating rather than simply dramatic, is that nobody inside or outside that organization seems entirely sure which one of those two things it actually is. And if that opening did not just lock your attention in place, hit that like button right now, because what is coming in the next several minutes is going to make that question feel like the least complicated and least consequential thing we discussed today, and that is not hyperbole. That is just an accurate description of the landscape we are about to walk through together. Because behind the winning streak, behind the impressive box scores, behind JJ Redick's carefully measured and professionally diplomatic post-game press conference language, there are not one or two but 4 or 5 genuinely significant storylines colliding simultaneously inside this franchise right now. And the remarkable thing is that each one of them, individually, would be enough to dominate an entire off-season news cycle on its own. There is a contract worth $250 million sitting on the table that needs to be signed, and that will define the financial and competitive architecture of this organization for the better part of the next half-decade. There is a 41-year-old man whose next destination, whether that turns out to be the same locker room he has occupied for years, a city 1,200 miles away where a fan base never stopped believing he would come home again, or the permanent silence of retirement, will reshape the competitive landscape of the entire Western Conference before the summer ends. There is a 21-year-old Chicago Bulls forward who just dropped a career-high 41 points 2 nights ago and is walking into Crypto.com Arena tonight with the kind of unburdened aggression that only players with nothing to lose can truly access. There is a second-year player being demoted to the G League for the second time in the same week, whose last name alone makes the entire situation impossible to discuss without feeling the weight of everything it implies. And hovering above all of it, casting the largest and most expensive shadow in professional basketball right now, is a 2-time MVP still under contract in Milwaukee, whose own teammate, the man who shares a locker room and practices with him every single day, recently rated his confidence in that star remaining a Buck next season at a 5 out of 10 on national television, without a moment of apparent hesitation. Every single one of these threads is connected. Every single one of them is already in motion, and every single one of them is about to be pulled starting right now. So let us begin with the thing that is sitting in plain sight and generating the most selective and convenient amnesia in recent sports media memory. Because the Lakers' current winning run deserves to be examined with considerably more precision than the takes it has been generating. Los Angeles sits at 40 wins and 25 losses, 4th seed in the Western Conference, riding momentum that feels different from the fragile momentum this team has occasionally manufactured earlier in the season. They have won 6 of their last 7 games. They have held 5 of their last 7 opponents to 106 points or fewer, which in a league currently averaging north of 115 points per game represents a meaningful defensive commitment rather than a scheduling accident. 2 nights ago, against the Minnesota Timberwolves, a team that has been to back-to-back conference finals and is built specifically to cause problems for teams without elite defensive infrastructure. The Lakers outscored them by 16 points in the third quarter alone, breaking a 45-45 halftime tie and essentially removing all competitive tension from the building in the span of 12 minutes. They held Anthony Edwards, one of the 5 most explosive and difficult to contain offensive players in the entire league, to 2 of 15 from the field and 1 of 10 from beyond the arc. That is not a fortunate defensive performance. That is a coordinated, well-executed game plan, executed by players who understood their assignments and carried them out with discipline. Luka Doncic contributed 31 points, 11 rebounds, and 11 assists for his 7th triple-double of the season, the kind of all-around performance that reminds you why he was considered the centerpiece of one of the most significant trades in recent NBA history. Austin Reeves matched him at 31 points with 8 assists. And the extraordinary detail inside that number is that 29 of those 31 points arrived in the second half, which is the kind of sustained and escalating offensive output you see from a player who is operating with genuine freedom and genuine confidence, rather than working within constraints imposed by someone else's gravitational pull on the basketball. DeAndre Ayton added 14 points and 12 rebounds, and drew specific praise from Redick for performing on both ends against one of the best front courts in basketball. This is a real team doing real things at a real level, and the man who has been described as its indispensable ingredient watched all of it from somewhere that was not the court. The intellectually honest response to that observation is emphatically not to declare that the Lakers have secretly been better without LeBron James all along, because that particular conclusion is the kind of reductive and engagement-optimized oversimplification that fills up social media timelines and produces almost zero genuine understanding of what is actually happening with this basketball team. The far more interesting and far more structurally illuminating truth is that the Doncic and Reeves 2-man operation produces something meaningfully different from what the full 3-man lineup produces. And different does not automatically mean lesser or greater. It means different in ways that have specific playoff implications that deserve to be examined honestly. When LeBron is out of the rotation, Doncic's usage climbs to the natural ceiling of his abilities, and Doncic operating at maximum usage with the ball in his hands and the freedom to dictate the pace and the point of attack on every possession is one of the most genuinely devastating offensive propositions in the history of the sport at any age, not just his current age. His ability to create for himself, to create for others, to manipulate a defense into giving him exactly what he wants and then punish whatever they chose to protect, operates at a different level when the offensive system is built around him, rather than shared among 3 players who all have legitimate claims on ball handling time. And when LeBron is out, Reeves stops being the third option and starts being the co-creator he was constructed to be, running pick and rolls with Doncic and Ayton, generating his own rhythm shots through movement rather than waiting to receive a catch-and-shoot opportunity that may arrive late or not at all, making decisions in transition with the kind of pace that defenders struggle to match. The Lakers are 10-2 when Doncic and Reeves share the floor without LeBron in this season alone. That number is not a coincidence. That number is a structure operating at its natural efficiency without the friction that comes from integrating a third ball dominant player whose instincts, after 22 years of being the answer to every basketball problem his team has ever encountered, do not simply switch off because the roster construction has changed. And here is where the question graduates from interesting to genuinely uncomfortable, because it is not asking whether the two-man version works. We have already established that it does. But whether LeBron James can return and become something he has never consistently and voluntarily been across 2.5 decades of professional basketball, which is a complementary player who willingly subordinates his natural instincts to somebody else's rhythm without the whole offensive architecture eventually drifting back toward him as its unconscious default. He has stated this desire openly and repeatedly. He spent the entire offseason working on catch-and-shoot threes specifically to prepare for the off-ball role. He talked on podcasts and in interviews about wanting to let Luka and Austin be Luka and Austin. And there was a stretch early in this season where that version of the arrangement actually materialized and looked genuinely beautiful, where LeBron came back from an absence and played primarily as the third option, where Doncic had somewhere in the neighborhood of 35 points and Reeves had 30, and LeBron contributed 25 without ever forcing or hijacking a possession. And the entire thing looked like a legitimate championship structure operating in prototype form. But then Reeves got injured, and LeBron had to become the version of himself that carries teams not because anyone asked him to, but because decades of competitive wiring do not negotiate with roster circumstances. And by the time Reeves returned, LeBron was already operating at maximum intensity, and the gradual reset never fully completed itself. This injury, this latest absence, functions as an involuntary but potentially necessary reset for everyone involved. The question is whether LeBron embraces that reset when he is cleared to return, and whether JJ Redick has both the coaching conviction and the organizational support to hold the structure in place even when the most decorated and most instinctively dominant player in the building starts generating possessions through sheer force of habit and competitive reflex accumulated across more than 2 decades of being the solution. That answer, when it eventually reveals itself over the next several weeks, will tell you more about this team's genuine championship ceiling than any box score produced before the playoffs begin. While that ceiling question attaches itself to LeBron's return timeline and what that return looks like in practice, the organization is simultaneously navigating what is arguably the most consequential single contract decision it has made in years, and the number sitting at the center of that decision is $240 million distributed across 5 years for Austin Reeves. Multiple franchises around the league are already positioning themselves to present competing offers the moment free agency opens its doors this summer, which is entirely rational behavior given what Reeves has become as a player and what he represents as a market commodity. Teams with legitimate title aspirations and a specific need for a playmaking, shot-creating, versatile guard who can function as a primary or secondary option depending on what the roster requires would line up to make that offer. The Lakers have responded to all of this reported external interest with what sources close to the situation describe as something approaching total organizational serenity. Zero concern about losing him, full intention to offer the maximum complete confidence that he stays. And here is where the honest and slightly uncomfortable analysis needs to find its footing. Because Reeves deserves neither the blind, unconditional devotion of his most passionate supporters, nor the reflexive and often personal skepticism of people who have struggled to forgive him for the Minnesota series last spring. This season, the version of Austin Reaves on display has been genuinely excellent in ways that his previous 2 seasons only intermittently suggested were possible. The maddening and inexplicable inconsistency that defined him before, the wild and demoralizing oscillation between looking like a genuine top 20 player in the league on Tuesday and looking like someone who had accidentally been issued an NBA uniform on Friday, has been conspicuously and encouragingly absent from his 2025-26 performance. He has evolved from a player who can occasionally make plays into a player who systematically reads defenses, processes information at game speed, and manufactures advantages with the deliberateness of someone who has done serious intellectual work on his craft, rather than simply reacted to whatever the defense presented. That growth is real. It is documentable. It is not nothing, and dismissing it because of what happened in previous playoff runs is its own form of lazy analysis. But the playoffs are arriving whether anyone is ready or not, and the playoffs have historically not been kind to Austin Reaves when the defensive attention around him intensifies, when his role quietly compresses from co-creator to supporting option, and when the margin for inefficiency shrinks to something that punishes any deviation from your optimal self. The Minnesota series last year was genuinely difficult to watch for anyone who genuinely believed in what Reaves could be. And while there is a legitimate structural argument that relegating him to a spot-up shooter role rather than allowing him to operate as a ball handler fundamentally changed what he was capable of producing, the results were what they were, and they cannot be retroactively edited into something more flattering. If the version of Reaves we have watched from February through March arrives in a playoff series and performs at that level or anything close to it, you pay that man every single dollar without a molecule of hesitation, because that version of Reaves surrounded by the right defensive infrastructure is one of the most complete and difficult to game plan creators in the league. If the disappearing act returns and this becomes another postseason where Reaves is a footnote in a loss rather than a chapter in a win, the situation becomes considerably more nuanced even at the maximum contract level, because his trade value remains real and his regular season performance remains genuine, and teams will always find room for players who can do what he does in April through October. The Lakers are making a substantial bet. The size of that bet is roughly equivalent to the GDP of a small island nation. The answer will not be knowable for at least 2 more months, and everything that happens between now and then, including tonight, carries weight that the standings alone do not fully capture. Tonight's opponent arrives carrying its own genuinely compelling subplot, and it would be a mistake to treat the Chicago Bulls as simply a convenient stepping stone positioned on the Lakers' schedule to extend a winning streak. The Bulls are 27-38, sitting 12th in the Eastern Conference, a franchise that made its organizational priorities explicit at the trade deadline by moving Kobe White, Ayo Dosunmu, and Nikola Vucevic, which in practical and symbolic terms is an organization drafting and filing its formal resignation letter from the current competitive season, while simultaneously beginning to think about what comes next. They are playing out the string toward a lottery position. That is the honest description of where they are. But Matas Buzelis scored 41 points 2 nights ago against Golden State in an overtime win, a career high for a 21-year-old who has averaged nearly 24 points across his last 6 outings and has scored 20 or more in every game where he has logged at least 30 minutes during that stretch. Josh Giddey, his backcourt running mate, posted 21 points, 13 rebounds, and 17 assists in that same game, which is the kind of triple-double line that makes people forget temporarily that his team is playing for lottery positioning rather than playoff seeding. Both players are listed as probable tonight despite ankle concerns, which means the Lakers, missing LeBron, missing Marcus Smart, missing Maxi Kleber, and missing Jackson Hayes, are walking into a game where the opposing team's two best players are healthy, motivated by the momentum of a significant win, and operating against a defense that ranks 20th in the league for the full season, despite its recent improvement. Colin Sexton, who is questionable with a leg injury after scoring 28 and 30 in his two most recent appearances, would add a third legitimate offensive threat if he is cleared to play. The Lakers should win this game. The Lakers are 10-point favorites at home, but basketball games in March between a short-handed contender and an ascending young talent with nothing to lose have produced stranger and more embarrassing outcomes than a competitive 48 minutes on a Thursday night in Los Angeles. And treating Buzelis as anything less than a genuine problem to be solved is exactly the kind of oversight that produces a headline nobody wanted. And operating somewhere in the organizational space between the injury reports and the contract, conversations, and the rotation decisions, Bronny James has been assigned to the South Bay Lakers in the G League for the second time within the same calendar week, this time accompanied by Dalton Knecht and Adu Tiro, which suggests this is less a targeted development decision and more a straightforward roster management move, driven by the fact that there are simply not enough meaningful minutes available at the NBA level for players on the periphery of the rotation. He was sent down Sunday, recalled Monday, reassigned Tuesday, and through all of it has carried himself with a professional composure that reflects well on him regardless of what you think about the circumstances that created this situation in the first place. His most recent G League performance, 17 points on 66% shooting in South Bay's victory, was genuinely encouraging in the context of a developmental arc, and the kid is clearly working and clearly improving. But the frank basketball assessment is that Bronny James has not yet demonstrated the perimeter shooting reliability, the playmaking creativity under pressure, or the defensive versatility that a franchise with serious playoff ambitions can responsibly deploy in minutes that actually matter. He is being developed, which is precisely what should be happening with him at this stage of his career. And JJ Redick has made it unmistakably clear through every rotation decision he has made this season that proximity to a famous last name carries exactly zero weight when determining who gets court time on this particular basketball team. The contrast between Bronny's repeated G League assignments and the organization simultaneously preparing a $250 million commitment for Austin Reeves communicates something unambiguous about what the post-LeBron chapter of Lakers basketball is being built around, and that communication is intentional rather than accidental, which delivers us to the question that makes everything else feel like a footnote, the question that will define what the Los Angeles Lakers actually are for the next 5 to 7 years, and it arrives in two massive and directly connected components that the mainstream conversation is not yet fully accounting for in combination. The first is LeBron James and where he physically is when the 2026-27 season begins, because he enters unrestricted free agency this summer for the first time since 2018. And the options on the table have been recently and significantly narrowed in ways that carry real consequences for multiple franchises simultaneously. The Golden State Warriors, who have been mentioned with persistent enthusiasm as a potential destination, given LeBron's publicly stated desire to share an NBA court with Stephen Curry before their respective windows of competitive excellence close permanently, have been effectively and apparently definitively removed from consideration. A source with direct knowledge of LeBron's thinking told Lakers Daily with the kind of unambiguous directness that rarely survives the editing process in public reporting that a farewell tour in Golden State would make no sense at all, and that the realistic universe of outcomes when this season concludes narrows to exactly 3 possibilities. Re-sign with the Lakers on terms both parties find acceptable. Return to Cleveland for a 3rd chapter with the franchise where everything began, or retire from professional basketball entirely. Cleveland carries the emotional gravity of a homecoming narrative that writes itself in the competitive substance of a roster featuring Donovan Mitchell and James Harden that could legitimately contend for an NBA championship with one more elite piece added to the structure. The Lakers have stated publicly that they would love to retain LeBron, but reports from multiple directions suggest the organization is unwilling to offer another maximum contract, and that any realistic reunion would require LeBron to accept a reduced salary as the franchise increasingly and irreversibly repositions its identity around Luka Doncic as its undisputed center of gravity. And retirement, the word that makes every NBA fan uncomfortable when it appears in proximity to LeBron's name, is not a dismissible or performative option for a 41-year-old man who is currently managing arthritis in his foot and a body that has been operated at the absolute maximum intensity the sport demands for more than 22 consecutive years. Nobody in the public conversation knows what LeBron decides. The people in his inner circle apparently do not know either. And that genuine uncertainty is going to define every other offseason decision this franchise makes, because the financial flexibility available to Los Angeles changes dramatically depending on whether LeBron's $52.6 million comes off the books or stays on them. The second component is the one that sounds like ambitious franchise fantasy until you examine the financial architecture being assembled underneath it and realize it is grounded in something considerably more concrete than wishful thinking. The Los Angeles Lakers are planning what multiple credible sources, including Sam Amick of The Athletic, are describing as a full and unambiguous all-out pursuit of Giannis Antetokounmpo this summer. And the deliberate and patient accumulation of assets and flexibility to make that pursuit at least theoretically executable has been the quiet organizational through line of the entire second half of this season. With LeBron's contract potentially expiring alongside the deals of Rui Hachimura, Luke Kennard, and Maxi Kleber, Los Angeles projects to have somewhere between $50 and $51 million in available cap space, a number that represents serious leverage in any trade or free agency negotiation involving a player of Giannis's caliber. They have preserved 3 tradable first-round picks in 2026, 2031, and 2033, specifically and deliberately declining to move those assets at the deadline, even when doing so might have addressed immediate roster needs, because the organizational calculation was that the summer opportunity justifies the short-term sacrifice. The Milwaukee situation surrounding Giannis is genuinely, measurably, and not for dramatic purposes, unstable. Bobby Portis, who practices with Giannis 5 days a week and has access to the kind of information that does not appear in press releases or beat reporter notebooks, was asked on national television on a scale of 1 to 10 how confident he was that Giannis would remain a Buck next season. He answered 5, out loud, without apparent concern for what that number would communicate to the world. That is not the response of a teammate operating from a foundation of private reassurance. That is the response of someone who is genuinely and honestly uncertain about the future of the most important player on his team. And in professional basketball, that level of uncertainty about a 2-time MVP does not resolve quietly in a press conference. It resolves in a trade that rearranges the competitive hierarchy of the league. A Luka Doncic and Giannis Antetokounmpo partnership in Los Angeles, surrounded by defensive wings with length and athleticism and a center who can protect the paint, would not merely be a good team. It would be the kind of roster construction that forces every other front office in the league to fundamentally reconsider its competitive assumptions and the recruiting pitch Los Angeles can make, the market, the platform, the franchise history, the chance to play alongside one of the 2 or 3 most gifted offensive players the game has produced in the past decade in Doncic, is a pitch that almost no other franchise can match in its totality. Whether the trade package can be assembled to Milwaukee's satisfaction against fierce and well-resourced competition from Golden State, Minnesota, Miami, and New York is the open and genuinely unresolved question that will dominate the summer regardless of how it ultimately concludes. But the intention is real and publicly confirmed. The positioning across this entire season has been deliberate and consistent. And tonight, while the future assembles itself loudly in the background, there is a basketball game scheduled for Crypto.com Arena, a questionable designation hovering over the most scrutinized left foot in American professional sports. 2 teams operating at completely opposite ends of what this season means to them about to share a floor. And somewhere in a Los Angeles home, a 41-year-old man watching his teammates win without him and thinking thoughts that the rest of us will not be allowed to hear until he decides it is time to say them out loud.